from the blackest corners of your mind, they call, pulling you deep into shadow, twisting your senses, keeping you from sleep. It's time to face your darkest fears. This is Tales to Terrify. Good evening, children of the night, and welcome. It's hard to believe, but we're already just a week away from the close of our annual flash fiction contest. That means you've got just a handful of days left to finish your terrifying folktale and unleash it on our judging team. You'd better get scribbling. Visit talestoterrify.com/flash contest for all the details and to submit. But hurry, the hour is drawing late, and we can't hold these gates forever. We have one tale for you this evening, about an attempted train robbery that brings a man face to face with his own personal ghosts. Our story tonight comes from Dannye Chase. Dannye Chase is a queer married mom of 3 who lives in the U.S. Pacific Northwest. She claims to write in many genres, but her oldest offspring suspects it all boils down to either romance or horror, or somehow both. You can find her on Twitter and Facebook as Dannye Chase, and at DannyeChase.com, where she gives weird writing prompts. Children of the night, join me for Dannye Chase's The Train Ticket, first published in Queer Weird West Tales, August 2022.
The wind, bitter and cold, seemed to move across the prairie like a train on tracks, as if a path had been carved for it in the wilderness, as if it were going where it was supposed to go, carrying its intended terrible cargo. The wind had its own shrieking whistle, and beneath that, it growled and rumbled, ever louder, ever closer. The cabin where Jacob had taken shelter was warm, with a fire burning at the hearth. That would not last. The wind was gaining strength, and with the sky mottled bluish-white like frozen skin, Jacob knew there was a storm coming, an awful one. Back home, back east, storms were separated from people, like a play going on outside the windows. You could sit by your fire eating food from your pantry. You could even sleep comfortably as the wind gave its performance. And if you did get into trouble, a neighbor was always nearby. You were just one shoveled path away from fire and food. Here in the West, there was no real difference between outside and inside. The walls of this tiny frontier cabin were not fully sealed. The pantry was empty and the stack of wood for the fire was meager and dwindling. Jacob had looked for more wood, but this was the prairie, a gray-green ocean of dormant grass with little isolated island cabins floating on it. Jacob might as well send a message in a bottle for help. It had as much chance of bringing rescuers as it would in an actual ocean. Of course, Jacob was far more foolish than any marooned sailor. He'd purposefully chosen this place as refuge, an abandoned cabin with no one nearby, no neighbors, not even strangers. The only signs other people existed were marks of their passing, wagon ruts in disuse because of the winter season, and train tracks branded onto the ground a half-mile away, with no stopping place, no station. Jacob paced restlessly in the cabin, hoping the movement would keep him warm. Already there were strange, unfocused shadows on the wall that fell when the wind fell, and danced when it blew, a drawing of the falling snow, as if it were falling inside as well. With the unsealed walls and the strength of the wind, perhaps in a few hours' time it would. The storm was unexpected. It shouldn't have been, honestly, because the prairie was an endless, unbroken stage for disasters on an epic scale. There were grass fires that raced along in wind-blown waves and consumed entire towns, cooking potatoes in the ground before they were harvested. There were tall, terrible storms that spun down from the sky and uprooted anything in their path, like a child plucking grass. And there were blizzards, like this, turning water into frozen, undrinkable crystals that isolated and then suffocated. Jacob was pacing, was so sure of his solitude, that when there was a knock on the door, he mistook it for the storm itself, mindlessly asking entrance to the cabin. But the knock came again, and then the door opened, and a man stumbled in. He was no neighbor, but neither was he a stranger, though wishing would have made him so. Jacob's unexpected visitor was a man he'd hoped he would never see again. Elijah Colburn. Elijah said nothing, just staggered toward the fire. He smelled of sweat and smoke and cold, and also just the faintest hint of roses. That sweet scent danced toward the ceiling, caught on the air swirling above the flames. Maybe it was Jacob's imagination, or maybe Elijah was wearing the scent on purpose. Maybe, in an inner pocket kept warm by his body heat, Elijah carried a little glass bottle of perfume that had once belonged to someone else. For a moment, the snowy cabin faded away in favor of a vision from Jacob's memories, a hot and dusty street where he'd have loved to feel a cold wind, where he'd have longed for a river and not a fire, and a man there in the shade cast by the roof of the saloon, tall and slender and smelling of roses. His name was Thomas, but everybody called him Bright. Bright had had a room above the saloon where in the summer, when the window was open to seek the breeze, his visitors had to keep quiet or give the whole street evidence of what they already knew was going on up there. But that was all right. Bright had his ways. He'd muffle a man with his mouth, or his hands, or a bit of cloth if he needed. In the winter, with that window shut and the saloon downstairs full up, a man could moan and cry and sob in that room, and no one but Bright would hear him. Bright liked to hear them, Jacob had always thought, a sign of a job well done. But Bright didn't like the smell of his work, so he spent some of his earnings on the rosewater, and that was an unexpectedly beautiful thing to find upstairs in that well-used room. But the most important thing about Bright in Jacob's mind was the fact that in the summer, his hands were always cold, and in the winter they were always warm. No matter the weather, a man could feel Bright's hands on his body and find them comfortable. Elijah Colburn had also lived in this town, and he strolled uninvited into Jacob's memory of that dusty street with Bright in the shade. At that, the spell broke, and Jacob was in the cabin again, with Elijah crouching by the fire. "You been following me?" Jacob asked. He could see Elijah looking in dismay at the few scraps of wood that remained on the floor. "I'm not the sheriff anymore," Elijah said. Jacob felt the whole cabin jerk under his feet, as if the storm had lifted and then resettled it. "Bullshit." Elijah shrugged, a strangely small movement for a man who used to stride down the street with sure steps. "You're not my job anymore, Jacob. I was just..." Elijah rubbed a stiff hand over the stubble on his jaw. I was just drifting. Drifting. Well, that's fine, Jacob said in a low, harsh voice. Going wherever you want, traveling free, no consequences for what you did, just starting over. Must be nice. I've known nice, Elijah said. It's not this. You're alive. Elijah must have warmed enough to move a little more, because he made it to a chair and folded his body into it. Neither of us will be for long if this doesn't let up. Jacob noticed that Elijah's hands were chapped raw with cold and wind. His face was gaunt, and the hair growing there was a dingy gray. How long have you been drifting? He asked. Elijah picked at his untidy layers of clothes. Since it happened. Just didn't do it with my feet until a couple months later, I guess. Jacob dropped into a chair on the other side of the table. They'd never quite sat like this, the sheriff and the criminal, but they'd each shared meals in the saloon with a man who smelled like roses. It was perhaps an odd thing that the sheriff would befriend a sinner, because legally, of course, what Bright did was forbidden. Elijah had never hassled him, though. Everybody knew Bright wasn't one of the town's many problems. Jacob had considered the larger question on his way up those stairs to Bright's room, and he'd never come to an answer. If what Bright did, if what men did with Bright, was wrong in a moral sense. Because it wasn't Bright's fault he needed to eat and drink and have a roof over his head. It wasn't his fault that he was soft and sweet and pretty, that his hands were always the right temperature, and that he could hold a man who wanted to be held or keep things harsh and hard with a man who didn't. Of course, it wasn't as if Jacob was morally upright himself, so he wasn't one to judge. Elijah, though, the sheriff, was supposed to be. He was paid to be right, legally right, with the expectation of being morally right if circumstances allowed. Jacob had seen the first real meeting between Elijah and Bright in the saloon. The left side of Bright's face had been swollen and red, the socket around his eye already turning black. It's not your fault, Elijah had told him, handing him a precious bit of ice in a cloth. Elijah had found the man who'd hit Bright and run him out of town. And after that, Elijah started going upstairs with Bright himself. And honestly, that was never the part that bothered Jacob. If Bright agreed to it, then Elijah had every right to be up there. But soon Elijah and Bright could be found in other places, too. Jacob saw them on the back porch of the sheriff's office, at the town theater, at the stables while Elijah tended to his horse. Jacob had thought at first that it was admirable of Elijah that he didn't keep Bright as a shameful secret, that he didn't hide the fact they were making plans. Probably, Jacob thought, if things hadn't gone so wrong, they'd have made it. Bright would have given up his room above the saloon and found lodging with Elijah. They'd have told visitors they were close friends, and over time maybe people would start to believe that was the whole story. And even if they didn't, Bright was a rose planted in a dusty town, and people wanted to see something in that dry hellhole still growing. Of course, it hadn't happened that way. Elijah was freezing to death right now in a cabin with an enemy, and Bright had been in the ground for over a year. A man named Hill had come into town one day and started making trouble. It was rumored he'd killed a man out on the prairie, so Elijah had locked him up. But Elijah couldn't make the murder charge stick, couldn't prove the case. Hill had walked free, right into the saloon, and taken Bright as his next victim, because everyone could see that revenge against the sheriff would start with Bright. Elijah had held a precious thing in his hands, and he hadn't been careful enough with it. All he had now was a fragile bottle of perfume, and when he froze to death it would crack. His corpse would smell of roses. In the cabin the dying fire snapped, and Elijah rubbed his hands together, looking around at the space. "Go on, say it," Jacob said. You're a half-mile from the train tracks, but I don't see any loot in this cabin. Unless you burned it. You turn over a new leaf, or did you have a misfortune?" "Only takes one misfortune to make you turn over a new leaf," Jacob said, and Elijah turned away, gazing down at his boots, the snow on them barely melted. "But if you want to hear it," Jacob said, "it's quite a story." A week before the blizzard, there had come a warm night for winter, near the freeze point. Jacob's breath had been barely visible, a thin mist under the black sky. There was a rhythm to robbing a train, just as sure as there was for driving one. Find a slow point near a curve, jog along, catch the ladder on a boxcar. The engineer would never feel it, the added weight of one man on a moving train. Then into the car, striking a match against a shoe in the dark, looking for whatever was easy to take before the next slow spot came up, and it was time to jump off. Jacob always worked quickly, tearing into the mail sacks and boxes of food. Liquor was there sometimes, jewelry of the sentimental type, books, tools, medicine, toys. Whatever would survive a fall to the ground outside the train to be picked up later with a wagon. The food Jacob would eat, and the rest he would sell. No one on the train was ever the wiser for it, not until they stopped at the next station and found things missing. Jacob had always stayed out of sight of guards, drivers, and passengers. Until that night. "The train was early," Jacob said. "That should have been a clue something was off. A whole hour early. But I figured I just got the time wrong, and I was there already, waiting, so I climbed on. It just took one step to realize I'd made a mistake. The metal felt funny under my feet, like it wasn't quite solid. It cracked like sugar or snow under my boots. Still, I started checking boxcars, hoping I'd find something. But they were empty. That should never happen. There shouldn't have been an empty train going west. There should have been the mail at least. I climbed all through the train, empty car after empty car, just blank space being towed across the prairie, fast as it could go. Finally, I got to the last one." Elijah was watching, unmoving, waiting to hear something Jacob could hardly explain. "You ever been the only person in a church?" Jacob asked. "You ever been with a group of people and you're the only one awake? That's what it was like. They were there, the passengers, same as you're here now. But every one of them was dead." Elijah slowly took the last scrap of wood off the floor and threw it into the fire, which seemed to consume it in an instant. "Who'd you see?" he asked, because they all knew this train. They'd heard stories passed around campfires, whispered in boarding house bedrooms, told with terror in saloons. The passengers on this train hadn't died in some terrible accident, suffocated with coal dust, or frozen solid on a winter night. They'd been dead before they climbed aboard. "Shaw, the one who ate those 2 cowhands last winter." On ships they called it the custom of the sea, eating other men's bodies as a means of survival. And it happened on the prairie as surely as on the ocean. Customary or not, Shaw had been hanged for it. "Maybe he didn't wait for those hands to die first," Elijah said. "Must have. He shot them while they still had meat on their bones." "Melvin Burritt was there too. I saw him on wanted posters for years. Poisoned 3 wives. "I didn't know he died," Elijah said. "I heard they caught him up in Abilene. I don't think he was hanged, though. He had a hole the size of a fist in the side of his head. And he was right beside Holstone. Olaf goddamn Holstone." This made Elijah look up in surprise. "What, the guy who's been missing 20 years in the wilderness? He didn't kill anybody, just got lost." "He must have done something, even if only God knew about it." The wind gave a particularly loud groan and the walls of the cabin flexed, letting in a dusting of snow. Jacob shivered and coughed. It felt as if he could suffocate on that fine snow. killed by the cold that was both outside him and inside. "Hell was there," Jacob said, as if it didn't mean more than any other name. But at this, Elijah stilled, sitting there unmoving while the flickering fire made his shadow dance on the cabin walls. "Looked like he'd been shot," Jacob said. "I don't know if it was because of that man on the prairie or Bright or somebody new, but he was the only one on the train I'd actually met." He nodded at me. "Did you ask him why?" The words fell from Elijah's mouth as if they were rotten. "Did you ask him how could he? Bright never did anything to anybody. He never did anything." Elijah looked up suddenly, his eyes wide. "Bright wasn't on that train." He didn't seem able to make it a question. "He wasn't there." "I didn't see him." Elijah took in a shuddering breath and was quiet again. "I didn't mean to get on the train," Jacob said. "It was a mistake, so I just waited there for it to slow down again. There was another curve where I'd jump off. I had a little hand wagon there, some water stashed. But the train never made the turn. It was like it was running on its own tracks." "'Cause the regular train don't go to hell," Elijah said. "The train got hotter," Jacob said. "The floor got sticky, but sweet like it was covered in melted candy. Could hardly lift my boots. And meanwhile, those people just sat there. I can't imagine they didn't know where they were going, but they stayed in their seats as if they'd paid for them. I guess they had." "How'd you get off?" "I finally jumped. It got so hot I started to think that maybe that sticky stuff on the floor wasn't candy. Maybe it was something people had in them, all melted out on the way to hell. I didn't want to melt, so I jumped. I hit the grass, and I was right back where I started, just a half a mile from here." Jacob was thirsty, and he grabbed for the jug of water on the table. Of course, it was frozen through. "It wasn't until I got back here," Jacob said on a dry throat, "that I realized I took something from that train without meaning to. I robbed it, I guess. One last take." He dug into his pocket and held out a slip of paper printed in blue ink, pretty as the script on a birth certificate. "Paid in full," it read. "One ticket to hell." The fire cracked and snapped in the grate, protesting as it was dying. Jacob's ears had frozen now, and his hands were almost too cold to hold the ticket. "I tried to burn it," he said. "Doesn't burn. Can't tear it up either." Elijah sat quiet, shivering. He didn't say to Jacob what he'd said to Bright. "It's not your fault." But it didn't mean it wasn't true. Jacob had only ever stolen. He'd never killed anyone, never hurt anybody. He wasn't a prisoner or a cannibal, not like those others on the train. Not like Elijah. If Elijah had managed to keep Hill in jail on that murder charge, Bright would still be alive. Honestly, Elijah probably deserved the ticket even more than Jacob did. Jacob had thought of it as soon as Elijah had come through the door, thought he could put the ticket into Elijah's pocket when he was too weak to refuse. It might even be right in some sense. It might be what Jacob was supposed to do. But there was a further thought that stilled Jacob's hand. If he sent another man to hell in his place, wouldn't that be enough to earn his own ticket once more? Of course, he could look at it the other way around. Jacob held a ticket to hell. He was damned already, so anything he did now would make no difference. He could kill Elijah, he could eat his body and burn his clothes and survive the storm. He could get revenge now and let God sort out whether Elijah deserved a seat of his own on that train. It seemed a useless thing to try to go to hell innocent. The fire burned lower, and the shadows it had been casting began to melt into formless darkness. It was a cold like Jacob had never felt before, far more dangerous than the winter wind that bit and scratched at the skin, because this was almost welcoming. It was like moving into another world where cold didn't matter anymore because your hands and feet and even your face had stopped registering it. Slowly, he got down off his chair and sat on the floor in front of the dying fire. Elijah followed suit, and they crouched there, as close as they could get to the fading heat of the flames. When the door blew open again, Jacob still thought it was the storm, gaining entrance for the finale. But the door shut after a moment, and Jacob realized he could feel footfalls on the floorboards. As they came nearer, he smelled roses. Elijah didn't believe it. Jacob could see that. When Bright came down on his knees between them, brushing snow out of his dark hair, you could see his face plainly. But Elijah stayed still, his eyes wide, hands curled into frozen claws. "It's not much of a fire," Jacob said, because he didn't see any reason not to speak. Bright tipped his head a little. "Still feels better in here than out there." "Been out there a while?" Jacob asked. Bright flicked his eyes around, considering. "I guess I've been drifting." "Yeah," said Jacob. "Elijah, too." Slowly, Bright reached out and took one of Elijah's frozen hands between his own. Bright's fingers were still working. Perhaps his hands were actually warm. "Been looking for you," Bright said. "Been looking for you, Sheriff." Elijah shuddered a little, but otherwise he made no move. It was hard to tell if he was even breathing. "Are we dead?" Jacob asked. "Did I freeze? Did I break my neck coming off that train?" His voice shook a little from the snow in his throat. "I don't know about any train," Bright said. "You wouldn't," Jacob told him. "No, you wouldn't." Bright started rubbing Elijah's nearest hand gently, although Jacob didn't know if it was really the kindness it seemed, trying to bring dying tissue back to painful life. "You know what I did before I came to your town?" Bright said. He was looking at Elijah, but it was Jacob who answered him. "I ever heard you talk about it?" "That's because the first people I cared for were dead. Cared for, I mean that. It was my sister and her kids, one of the epidemics out east. And then when we started traveling west, there were some cold nights with rain. An old lady got soaked, never warmed back up. There were accidents with guns, a slipped knife." Bright gave a shiver and turned his head toward the fire. He blew on it as if to encourage the flames to build, and they managed a weak rally. "I know they weren't people anymore, but they looked like people. And I never minded that it was a lie, because it wasn't their fault. I washed them, made them look nice again, even though it seemed stupid to do that before you put them in the ground. When I got farther out west, though, I didn't want to do it anymore. It just seemed like a lot of work for something that didn't help anybody. So I changed professions, took care of the living. And sometimes, every once in a while, they took care of me." Bright leaned forward and blew again, but this time to warm Elijah's hand. "It wasn't your fault, Sheriff," he said. And at that, Elijah finally moved, breaking down into sobs, slumping against Bright's shoulder. Bright seemed to relax then, holding the larger man up in front of the dying fire. They were probably a lot warmer like that than he was, Jacob guessed. He and Elijah should have been holding each other the whole time. There was quiet for a while, except for the scream whistle of the wind. "I need to tell you," Jacob said, "that I found a train to hell." He held up the ticket to the firelight. "Hill was on it, in case you need to know that to find your peace." Bright looked at the ticket. "Pretty lettering," he said. "I saw it once myself," Elijah said. His voice was gravelly from the tears, and he sounded older than he'd been before Bright came in, and much, much older than he'd been back in that dusty town when all the players had still been upright in their places. "Wasn't a train, though. When I was a kid, we lived farther west than this, before the railroad got that far, so every day we heard noises of wagons, animals, kids. But once I heard them at night, loud as anything. No kids, all animals and adults, screaming. I went outside to see. The funny thing is, there was a light at the front, like there would be with a train, you know? I remember that, because it didn't swing back and forth like a light on a wagon, either. It was steady as anything, coming right toward our little town. I had no idea what it could be, and only later when I saw a train at night for the first time, then I recognized it, how the light just held still while everything was moving. I was scared, but I didn't run off. Maybe I was too scared to run, but I saw that light get bigger, and then the whole thing just rushed by me. There weren't any wagons. It was a huge herd of cattle running by, and there were people on horses chasing them. I heard these awful screams, but all those people had their mouths shut. They had their eyes open, though, when they looked at me when they went past. They didn't look evil, really, just resigned, not scared, not guilty, not desperate, just accepting. Made me wonder how long they'd been chasing that herd, and how much longer eternity is after that. The next day, the school teacher dropped dead in class. Diphtheria. Wasn't normal for an adult to die of it, but I guess she was younger than I thought. She seemed like a grown-up to me, but she was probably no more than 16. The other kids in school, they started dropping too. My mom said diphtheria is the worst way to go. Suffocated from within. So she took me and my brother and we went off. Lived on the prairie a couple of weeks in a canvas tent. It was summer and the tent was so damn hot that we just slept out on the grass. We were all alone out there. No town, no friends, no wagons. We came back and my friends were dead. I never told anybody I saw the death hunt omen the night before. If anybody else saw it, they didn't say either. Bright had taken Elijah's other hand now, and he was rubbing it gently. Elijah was staring at the fire. I don't know what those people did to have to chase that herd, but I wonder if they knew what it meant when they came through a place. Were they trying to warn people that something awful was coming? Were they so evil that they were glad people were going to die? Or were they just trying to get away from something awful themselves, but never able to shake it? And I wondered about the family who brought the diphtheria in. It was probably some kid on a wagon who died out on the prairie a couple of days after coming through. They couldn't have meant to do it. Nobody would kill kids on purpose. Had to be some terrible mistake they didn't even know they were making. I wondered if they would feel they'd been punished enough, losing their own kid, or if they thought about all those other kids who were going to die in our town. I wondered if those parents would end up chasing the cattle. Sometimes I think I became a sheriff because I didn't want to end up on that hunt myself. The fire was down to embers. Elijah put his hand on Bright's shoulder, and they watched the light go out together. The fire had been so small it wasn't making much heat, but it still felt much colder as soon as the flames were gone. It wasn't completely dark, though. The snow had a luminescence they hadn't been able to see before. The cabin shuddered in the wind at irregular intervals, impossible to get used to. In the dim light, Bright reached out to Jacob and pulled him close. Bright's hands were warm after all, or at least not as cold as Jacob's. And now the three of them were one last lump of heat in front of gray ashes. "What's it like, Bright?" Jacob asked. "Does it hurt?" "I don't remember. I do remember the gun. It was hot. I didn't expect that it would feel hot against my skin. I was afraid it would burn me. And there was a lot of blood, and I didn't want that. I'd always thought I'd waste away, you know. Some dignified death in bed. Not something somebody would have to clean up." "I did it," Elijah said. "I cleaned you up." Bright shifted a little. "You did? Wanted you to look nice. Jane, you know, the piano girl, she made you a little piece of lace. Worked all night on it, all day the next day, so that you'd be..." Elijah's voice began to hitch. "So you'd have something nice to be buried with. Something a friend made you." "I don't remember any of that," Bright said. He sounded sad. "Do you remember anything before this cabin?" Jacob asked. "Walking, drifting, but not, you know. I feel as if I'm heading somewhere, but it's just me and I don't really know where. I guess I'll know when I get there." "Does it feel like a bad place?" Jacob asked. "I don't think so." "Makes me wonder," Elijah said. "Hell's got a train, horses, probably wagons too, ships. I heard there were death ships, but to get to heaven, you just walk." "Maybe nobody would walk themselves to hell," Jacob said. "I don't know why there aren't more people," Bright said. "I always thought I'd see my mom again when I died. Not just her, other people I've lost." "You thought you'd get an answer," Elijah said. "I guess I did." They were gradually losing the last of their warmth. Jacob could feel the cold pricking over him one last time, sharp and then numb. "What was the question?" he asked. Bright shifted. On his other side, Elijah had gone completely still. "I suppose we might have time for one more story," Bright said. "We came west across the prairie when I was 14. I had a best friend on the wagon train. Her name was Alma, and she was the same age as me. We older kids used to take some of the little kids out into the grass to play in the evenings. The youngest ones hadn't walked much during the day, you know, and we needed to tire them out so they'd sleep. So one night, right after dinner, we left the wagons and went out into the grass. It was high summer, so it was hot. The sun would get into the sky in the morning and seem like it would never leave. It was still so light after dinner that you'd swear the day wasn't moving at all. The grass was tall where we were, which was good, because the oxen were staying fat. But it was so high that you could lose a small child in it. We had strict instructions, never take your eyes off the babies. The older kids, sure, but not the little ones who were just walking. Alma's mom had twins, maybe a year old, so we were each assigned one, Alma and me. I don't even remember their names now, but they were close, like two puppies from the same litter, cried if they were separated. When you put them down, they were like any kids. They'd stagger off in some direction on those little legs, but those two always went the same way, so they were easy to watch. It only took one of us. I said I'd take a turn watching them first. Wasn't hard. You just follow behind them, let them pluck up the grass, let them throw it, but keep it out of their mouths. Bright's voice began to sound pained and thin. I was doing my job. I was doing what I was supposed to do. I didn't lose those babies. Their mother came when I started yelling, and people picked them up and took them back to the wagon train. But Alma... It's okay, Elijah said. You don't have to. Jacob could feel Bright let out a shaky breath. Maybe there are no answers, Bright said. Maybe that's the deal. Or maybe only some people get answers. You know what I did above the saloon? Against the law. Against the Bible, doubly so because I'm a man lying with other men. Maybe I don't deserve answers. What happened to Alma? Jacob asked. If you want to say. That's just it. I can't say. She vanished. Just like God reached down a hand and plucked her up. Alma and I were talking. She was saying she'd had this dream where this little buffalo came into camp and was tame as anything, like a dog or a horse, and we kids all took turns riding around on it. I looked at her then because I was laughing. Just 1 second to glance at Alma, and then back down to the little ones. I could have looked longer. Those babies didn't move too fast. But I didn't. I just looked down and brushed some dirt off their little legs. And when I looked back, Alma was gone. If you're big enough, you make a trail through the grass so people can follow. You stride through and break the stalks, bend them, and crush them. The babies, they can't. They fight the grass to even move. But someone Alma's size, it was easy to find where she'd been. But her trail just stopped. Jacob had gotten so cold now that he couldn't feel his legs at all. He didn't mind. His legs had cramped up with cold, and it was nice not to have to shift them around anymore to get some relief. The only one of them really moving now was Bright. We were on the prairie, Bright said, following the wagon trail. And that was the only thing there. Occasionally a tree, but otherwise just the trail and the flat places where other trains had camped. And the grass, endless grass, like an ocean, like a desert, hot and full of bugs you could hear but not see. There were things underground, burrowing, and birds in the sky, and us on the grass. We didn't belong there. I felt that so surely that night, the oxen sure, the buffalo, but there wasn't much food there for us. Wasn't the kind of shelter humans need. We had to bring it all with us. There was a full moon, and we looked for Alma all night. We went out with poles and sticks trying to find loose places in the ground where she could have fallen. We yelled her name until we lost our voices. Pretty soon her track through the grass was gone because so many people had come over it. By noon the next day the grass was flat for as far as he could see. I remember thinking that the wagon trains that came after us would think we must have had hundreds of wagons to make a camp that big. People had some theories. We thought maybe she'd fallen sick and was just lying in the grass somewhere. But how could she have gone any place without leaving a trail? A person her size crawling through the grass makes even more of a trail than someone walking. So we wondered if Indians got her. Maybe they could snake through the grass, steal someone right beside our wagons. But we never saw any sign of them at all. Then we thought maybe it was an animal, a coyote or something. But an animal dragging a body would leave a trail too, and there was just nothing. Nothing at all. Eventually we moved on. We were only about a day from the next river, and we'd planned to stop there a couple days, wash clothes, make repairs. So when we reached it, we sent a party back to keep up the search. Even sent a rider back to find the wagon train following us. to tell them we'd lost someone, to keep an eye out for her, and to please tell the next train down the line. Sometimes I wonder if they're still doing that, years later. Is every train that comes through told that there's a girl missing? Is Alma famous now? It would be a weird kind of famous that only happens when you no longer exist. Bright had stopped moving now, too, except to talk, and his voice fought the wind to be heard. I spent the whole rest of the trip looking backwards, thinking she'd catch up. She never did. And now I'm back on the prairie myself, and she's still not here. It wasn't my job to watch her, but I always think that if I had... "What do you think happened?" Jacob asked. "I think she died, but harder than other people die. Just erased. I don't know why. I don't know what she ever could have done to deserve it." Bright moved suddenly, and it shifted Jacob, who could barely keep himself from falling over. "Sheriff?" Bright asked. "Elijah, come on, wake up." "Is he gone?" Jacob asked. "Is he dead?" Elijah made a groaning noise, and Jacob could feel Bright sigh in relief. "Listen, Bright," Jacob said. "You got somewhere to be besides here, I know it, and it's no train or cattle run. And if you want him with you, then take him." "Are you sure?" Bright asked. "You'll die without his body heat." "He doesn't have any left to give. Anyway, I got a ticket to someplace warm." Bright began moving, shoving at Elijah, trying to get him up. Jacob did fall over, his arms too heavy with cold to properly catch himself. He lay there a moment until he felt Bright shift him, resting his head on his arms by the cold fireplace. "You know," Bright said, "just because you have a ticket doesn't mean you have to get on the train." "What?" "Jacob, this place is an edge, a sharp one, I think, between a lot of things. Life and death, right and wrong. This is the place between what we meant to do and what we did. If you stay here, you might never have to know which side you belong on." Bright managed to stand up, and it took a moment, but he helped Elijah to stand too. Outside, the wind dropped off quite suddenly, and the silence was shocking. The door creaked when Bright opened it. The snow that had lain against the door fell inside in a shower of crystals, and they reflected the moonlight so that Jacob could see Bright and Elijah walk out together. Bright kicked away the snow to close the door, and when he did, the wind started back up. But the fire in the grate was once again burning hot.
That was Dannye Chase's The Train Ticket, as read by Andrew Gibson. Andrew was pulled feet first from the swamps of South Louisiana, kicking and screaming, and he remains mostly as such to this day. You can find his work on Audible under Andrew Gibson, or, for the more romantically inclined, Blake Lockhart. You can also catch him streaming his recording sessions live in the Narrator Nook and the Haven Discord servers. Links are in the show notes. Thank you, Andrew. Well, children of the night, the hour is late, and we've run out of tales to tell. For now. Tales to Terrify is made possible by the tremendous generosity of our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. Incredible fans like Lestle Baxter, Amanda Carrillo, Amanda Gottfried, and Orion D. Hegre, whose generous support keeps these lights on and flickering ominously. If you're not a supporter, head over to patreon.com/Tales to Terrify. You'll find all kinds of perks, like ad-free episodes, bonus content, and one-of-a-kind collectibles. Every dollar goes back into this show, and we appreciate your support so much. Want another way to support the show that doesn't cost you a cent? Head over to Podchaser, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts and drop us a 5-star review. You'll not only put an unnaturally wide smile on our faces, but help new listeners discover our terrifying tales too. You can show your love of the show out in the world with some Tales to Terrify merch. TalesToTerrify.com/merch will take you to our TeePublic store, where we've got a great collection of creepy custom and curated designs. Tales to Terrify is produced by Seth Williams, Meredith Morgenstern, Andrew Gibson, Crystal Hammond, Spencer Disparty, and myself, Drew Sebastini, with original theme by Nebulous Entertainment. Tales to Terrify is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Join us again next week as we embrace the demons of our past with more Tales to Terrify.